Let's just agree that this is it. Portland, Maine, I don't know where that is. Leave your bags in the car, keep it running. I won't pretend that I want these things. But Portland, Maine, I don't know where that is. And I don't wanna know. I don't wanna know.
All right, happy Friday. Welcome back. Episode 82 of Morning Coffee with Rick Alexander. I'm at Rick Alexander _ on Instagram. I've got some pretty cool things coming up. If you're interested, follow me along there. You can follow at Lionheart Radio. Of course, we always do we put memes up about the show and sort of just interact with the audience there. So plenty of ways for you to get involved. I've also got an endurance coaching program coming out in the next couple of weeks to help you hit your first marathon or PR marathon, ultra marathon, triathlon, whatever it is. It's going to be very comprehensive. All you'll have to know is that those are something you want to do, and then you'll be able to leave the rest to me. Of course, the work will be on you, but I will give you a complete program, be completely customized to your lifestyle. We go through mindset. We're going to go through all of the things that have stopped you in the past from getting to the finish line. So if you're interested in that, hit me up and we can start opening that dialogue, but I'll be releasing more details about that in the coming weeks. Today's episode is actually nothing to do with endurance. It is all about the resistance that you feel in everyday life. Now, one thing that's not up for debate is the idea that resistance is the thing that makes you stronger. In fact, you can't get stronger without resistance. We know that in the gym. In life, when life starts handing us resistance, it's not so straightforward. We don't necessarily know how to, there's no linear progression you can prescribe sometimes to use the resistance that life hands us in order to get stronger. And that can be some of our downfall, right? Because we don't know necessarily how to handle it. Now, the reason I'm dropping this episode today is because we've had a little bit of time since the holidays. And so you've gotten a little space. So maybe you're back home, you're back into your routine, you're working, you're just going through your life again. Well, look back. Look back at, especially if you went home for the holidays. This is something I noticed just sort of trending on social media. I notice it in my own life many times. And it's a very complex thing that's happening here sometimes. Sometimes we go home and we feel resistant. Now, if you didn't go home for the holidays, there are plenty of ways for you to think about where some of this resistance might be showing up. It might be showing up when you're around a person that you don't like. But sometimes when we go home and it's like after 7 days of being around our families that we grew up with, we're like ready to get the hell out of there, right? Now, some of that could be a very multifaceted reason for why you're feeling this resistance and why you're wanting to leave there. But I'm going to offer another explanation for it. And it's the same explanation for why sometimes you meet somebody and you don't like that person. And so you tend to stay away from them. The problem is that staying away from them isn't going to actually get you stronger. Carl Jung, the psychologist, he introduced this idea called the shadow. Now, the shadow are all of the things that occur in your life that you don't associate with your identity. And so you repress them, you push them further down. In the Clarity Academy, we're going to do a bunch of shadow work, but I'm going to try to introduce the topic here in a simplistic way so you can at least think about it in your own life and how some of your shadows might be showing up. So when you're born, right, you know nothing of this world. You are just simply figuring it out. And then as you go through life, you start creating this identity of what you would call yourself. And you start taking things on that you want to associate with yourself. Well, at the same time that you're taking things on, you're like, oh, okay, like that's me. I'm outgoing. So you take the word outgoing and then that becomes part of your identity, right? Well, one of the other things that you do is you take things that you don't like. Now, a lot of times our family will have characteristics that we won't like. So perhaps maybe your family's not as educated as you'd like them to be or something like that. So you look at some behavior that they do, you categorize that as uneducated, and then you say, that's not me. So you repress it. Now, the problem is, of course, you are very complex and there are a lot of parts of you that you don't necessarily understand yourself. And so you can see why when you repress and you push stuff down that's actually part of you, it's going to manifest and come out in different ways. Again, now it's really hard to do some of this shadow work, but the idea is that you would look at all of the things that you don't like about yourself, and that you would sort of integrate them and help them to become part of who you are in your everyday life. Because one of the reasons that we feel resistance around people that we don't like, who personify things that we don't associate with ourselves, is because it's like holding a mirror up. So sometimes when we go home to our families, especially over the holidays, and we've disassociated ourselves with tons of those characteristics that we grew up with, because we say, that's not us anymore. It's really hard to be around family because it's like they're holding a mirror up to say, this is actually how we are. And that can be really uncomfortable. And it can manifest in different ways. Sometimes we're an asshole to those people because we're like, we just want to reject it, right? It's like our self, the self that we've manufactured, has all of these protective mechanisms in place to protect it from what it doesn't want. And so if it doesn't want to associate with certain characteristics, perhaps you'll come off as, like in the uneducated example, perhaps you come off as like really snooty and above people. Now, of course, the reason you want to be fully aware of all of the different aspects that actually do comprise your characteristics, yourself, is because then you can integrate them and then you get to act on your own volition. But if you repress the shadow sides of you, the sides you don't like, when you are around somebody that does exemplify those characteristics, you're going to act in a way that might not be how you would actually want to act, right? Because I would argue that it's not a good idea to go home and be an asshole around family, or to even be a dick around somebody that you don't necessarily like all the things about them. In fact, I would say that if there are characteristics that you don't like, it's not that you have to accept them, but you can be truthful while still offering grace to another person. It's like you don't have to change how you feel about the world or what you think is important or what you think are important characteristics to exemplify in yourself, but you can still offer grace to people that don't necessarily exemplify characteristics that you would think are important. It's not a good enough reason because you don't agree with them to be an asshole, if that makes sense. Or to be any other thing other than associate with them as a decent human being. And sometimes when we act in ways that we like look back and we're like, God, why would I have done that? Well, that's why, because you are repressing characteristics that you actually aren't even that well aware of. And listen, if the idea of becoming a more decent human being isn't enough to convince you, and then we could also start with the fact that when you are around people that you feel resistance toward, it actually doesn't affect that person nearly as much as it affects you. And so you walk around with anger, like being an asshole actually affects you much more than the other person a lot of times, because you're having to deal with some of these characteristics that are manifesting in you that you wouldn't even want. And that's the benefit of fully integrating the shadow side of you. Because then when you repress it, you act in ways that are not necessarily by your own volition. But when you are aware of them and you can acknowledge that that is part of you, that is, for whatever reason, that is something you grew up with, or that is where you come from, whatever that is, whatever the resistance is that you're struggling with, when you acknowledge it, you can then face it in truth while extending grace to that person. Because sometimes I think when somebody has characteristics that we don't like, we say, well, like, I don't like that person. But at the end of the day, that's a human just like you are a human. And they have tons of sides of them, just like you have tons of sides of you. And sometimes you know that there's all of these different nuances that you have about yourself. And it's really easy for you to be graceful with yourself because you know you have all these intricacies. But sometimes when we see other people and they exemplify characteristics that we don't like, we forget the fact that they're a nuanced human being just like we are. If you can integrate the shadow side of you, the sides that you are not necessarily too stoked about having, you can extend grace to other people. You don't have to become a victim of these repressed feelings that you have, because then there's so many different ways, and we could get into it, but there are so many different ways that a shadow that has not been integrated it's going to manifest in your life. Sometimes you're going to project things that aren't true onto other people. Sometimes you're going to be an asshole. But at the end of the day, if you can acknowledge that there are sides of you that maybe you wouldn't choose, but they are still there, maybe you can integrate them, and maybe you can do so by giving yourself a little bit of grace too. Because you need to understand, like, you are a super complex human being. You know, one of the things that I have began to understand about the human being as I've started writing this new book is that the human goes in and out just as much as the universe goes up and out. There are layers of complexity and depth that we can't even fathom. I think one of the ways that we begin to understand some of that depth is to understand the shadow side of us, the things that we're not too stoked about, but are part of us nonetheless. And so the question for you today might be, as you Think about, especially if you were home for the holidays and felt resistance, but if you're around people, in-laws, people that rub you the wrong way or put you in a bad mood, maybe you need to ask yourself, is that because they exemplify some characteristic that you actually have about yourself, but that you're not too okay with? If you can integrate it, you can acknowledge it, you can begin to be at peace with it. And that's when you can really begin to change your life. Because, if you walk around pissed off, that's not what the holidays are about. That's not what like spending time with other people is about. And you're going to be a lot better off if you can figure out how to do that. And that's really complicated. So I understand that that's not going to get done just by asking yourself a simple question. But even being aware of it is a really good start. I hope you guys have an amazing weekend, and I'll talk to you on Monday on Morning Coffee.